Hello. I'm going to try and not use the mic just because I'm already self-conscious enough without amplifying. And it's not weird at all that I was sitting in the corner that whole time while you came in. That's not weird. So when I first spoke to Dan about coming, I thought, well, originally we were talking about doing workshops, doing mixing. So easy stuff, sit in front of a computer, say, here's a compressor, whatever. And then we decided, well, it'll be more of a talk. And I thought, well, great, I'll just talk about compressors. That's easy. And then I thought, well, no, I'm going to Oxford. I need to challenge myself. And so what I've decided to do tonight is to talk about the things I think about, which is not necessarily the things I do. And this isn't a, do as I say, not as I do moment. This is just the things that go inside my head when I'm thinking about, is a mix good enough? Is it done? What's the point? All of that. So I haven't given this particular talk in public, so I'm going to have to look at my notes a little bit, and I might stumble a little. But hopefully we'll go off into the weeds, and then we're going to have Q&A where you can ask about compressors, and that'll be easy compared to everything else. So first of all, I just like looking at this and listening to that playlist. I am a lucky, lucky man. That is crazy. So that's me. And I'm here, and that's today. And what I wanted to talk about was not the mechanics of mixing or making a record or composing, because I think there are quite a few composers in the audience as opposed to people who just mix. And so, but I think these concepts are as relevant. And one of the sort of interesting things about what's been happening in the music industry lately is because it's been decimated by downloading and now streaming, and there's no money for anybody whatsoever. There is still this sliver of it that's chasing money, and there is the pop market, and it's huge, especially in Asia and other parts of the world. That pop market is massive, and it makes lots and lots of money. But for everybody else, it's gone back to being a little bit more about the art and less about the commerce, because the commerce is so uncertain. And I think in a lot of ways that's really great, because for the last probably 50 years, the recording business was just printing money. So it all became about printing money, and how can you do that? And you always had artists within it, and some of them would be successful and some wouldn't. But now you're at a point where every artist can put their product out into the world, right? It's not just the ones who happen to get some money from a record label and go into a studio. Every laptop is a studio. Every room is a live room. And you can make a record anywhere in the world and put it out the next day, whether it's on YouTube or you go through a distributor and it's on all of the digital things that people can listen to it on. So I think it's a really great time to sort of remember about the thousands of years of music that was before recording existed. So composition could be a job, and some of them are very high-paying jobs. Lots of court composers. There are plenty of buildings around here that probably had a composer tied to them or came up through there. But the idea of music as art, and for the definition of art, I mean, I've heard some people define it as something that you don't need to do to survive. And if you do that, then that's art. And that makes some sense, but there are plenty of things I don't need to do to survive that I would not call art. And we don't have to talk about them in this room. But I think that my definition of art as someone who tries to help other people create art and get it out into the world is that it is something that you make that you present to someone else to try and elicit an emotional response. That's art. It can be a positive response, a negative response. It can be a protest sign. It can be a song. It can be a sculpture. It can be a concept. And I'm going to be very pretentious later in the talk, and we'll talk about the concept a little bit more. But I love the idea of music as art, because even if you're going for commerce, you have to go for art, because there were lots of records I've been working on where someone will make a decision based on what they think would be popular, or that would be more like this other record. But then if that record isn't popular, what you're left with is a compromised piece of art, because you've made decisions based on the commerce side of it, which may or may not work out. I mean, how many people were on MTV Cribs before they canceled the series? Not that many. So the idea of making the music for its own sake, and a record is a piece of art that happens to contain music, which is also art, so it's meta art or something ridiculous like that. But the idea of record making as art as well. And so when you look at making records that way, I'm going to use my remote now. So the only thing that matters when you're making a record, I'll talk specifically about making records because that's what I do. So the only thing that matters is what comes out of the speakers. That's it. There's no argument you can make which would make me add something to that list. It's what you get when you listen to the record. That is the art, and that's the art coming towards the listener. The listener then reacts however they're going to react, and every listener reacts differently because otherwise there'd only be one popular band. Everybody has different tastes. But that's the idea. What comes out of the speakers? Now, why is that important? Well, I'll take you on a slight tour through my life, but first let's talk about just recording in general. So, to be fair, these graphics are all from yesterday. So I've stolen graphics from all over the internet, and most of them are not terribly good and completely inappropriate. But let's talk about the difference between sound and recording. So see if we can actually, oh, it's dead. Oh, stay. Okay, so that's sound. We good with that? It's actually water pouring out of somebody's skull. But let's say this is something making sound in a room. And that's not too far off from how chaotic and crazy a sound wave is in a room. It's interacting with everything that's going on with the convection in this room because of the heat. It's hitting walls and floors and bouncing back, and you're getting my voice off of about 25 surfaces if you're sitting in the back of the room. So this is the idea of sound in a room. And this is, when you're recording, what somebody's doing. Now, it can be a person singing, it can be a piano, it can be a guitar amp, it can be anything. But you make a sound wave, right? And then to make a record of that sound wave, are we still working? Ooh. So you record it. And traditionally, there are two different ways to record it, analog or digital. So that's supposed to be analog up top, digital on the bottom. I think that's pretty clear. So the idea is you make a representation that you can store, and then you can play it back later. That's the idea of recording. Recording is just a delay. That's all it is. And you do it by taking a microphone or something like that, which has this incredibly flimsy sheet, and you make it like an eardrum and stick it up in the air and put it in the way of that total chaos that is the sound wave, so that it moves the same way the sound wave's moving, and it creates either a voltage, well, it creates a voltage. That's what microphones do. And then you either record it on some bizarre analog format by converting it into magnetic fields or something like that, or you digitize it by putting it through an A to D converter, which we're not going to talk about tonight. That's lecture 8 of this series, is when we talk about A to D converters. So the idea being that you take this total chaos that's in the room that you can't grab, you can't see, you can't do anything except hear it, and capture it and store it. And once it's stored, you can mess with it, right? You can EQ it, you can compress it, you can play it backwards, you can pitch it up, you can pitch it down. You can do a million different things to transform that sound while it's in one of the forms on the right, okay? Then, eventually, you take your transform bit, play it out of a really jagged-looking speaker, and it's back out in the room. So now pretend all that water is going into that person's head, but only through their eardrums. I didn't find a better graphic for it. But the real point of this is, though, that that is total chaos. Once it comes back out of the speaker, you do not have any control over it anymore. It's going to make its way through the air, whether it's from an earbud to the eardrum, so it's only traveling 2.5 centimeters, or whether it's from my mouth, well, we're talking about recording. So a recording of this out of a PA system, which will never happen, to the back of a stadium. Whatever it is, it comes back out, it turns back into chaos, and then someone's ears get in the way, and then they listen to it, and then they have a reaction to it. So that is recording in a nutshell. The idea, though, that's very important, and we'll come back to this later, is you do not have control over it once it's out of that speaker. You have ultimate control over it before it comes out of the speaker. So while you're working on it and manipulating it, it's up to you to make it the thing that you want to come out of the speaker to elicit the response. Now, the whole point of this is, that's audio. Come on, you can do it. No, I'm going to use the space bar because it's easier. Okay, so let's look at a little list of things that don't come out of the speakers. And what I want to do is group this sort of along my career and how this went. I was a ardent enthusiast of things that did stuff when I was a kid. You push a button and something else happens, and that was amazing. And that manifested itself in doing lights and sound for band in high school. And then I saw a recording studio for the first time. And okay, that's what I need to do. And at the time, there were 2 universities in the States that had 4-year degree programs. And my parents said, you are getting a degree, period. So I had a choice between Berkeley in Boston and Miami, University of Miami. So I decided to go to University of Miami. Now, while you're at a university, as any of you who are at university or teach at university know, you are surrounded by people who do exactly what you do. They do it in different ways, but they know the jargon, they know the tools, and it's all you talk about. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and sometimes you go home and you bore your parents with it. But that's it. You're in this tiny, tiny little world, and while you're a student, at least for me, you're creating art, for lack of a more general word for what I made while I was in school. Art's kind of a stretch. But you're making lots and lots of things that are really for just the consumption of your peers, right? It's not going out into the world unless you're really lucky or you're recording the choir here that makes 2 albums a year, something like that. You're making little pieces that you play at recitals for other people who do what you do. And if you're lucky, you write a piece that gets performed, things like that. So there are all of these things that you think about and you talk about with each other. And then, oh, yeah. But these are the things I used to talk about, except the trouser thing, because we call it pants, but that's different here, so I didn't want to... You're always wearing pants when you mix, right? Well, I guess if you're in a kilt, you might... Anyway, so, but the idea is, I remember hundreds of conversations where I had done a piece in the electronic music lab, or I'd recorded a band, and I wanted to play it for somebody, either someone else at school, or my parents, or my brother, who was a very harsh critic. And I would start by at least 5 of these things, like, by the way, I compressed these drums, it's so awesome, and I used a phaser on the bass and the chorus, and it's a little bit, it's not as one, because I didn't have the best microphones to use, and they were set up in a weird way, and the drummer wasn't that good. And then you hit play. And first of all, you set people up for disappointment, so it's a terrible way to go. You just want to say, this is going to be great. But also, as soon as you hit play, that's all erased. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't help to know that the drummer was terrible. They're going to hear that the drummer is terrible. That's coming up as soon as you hit play. So it is pointless to talk about these things, but you do. You do. Then you get out of university, and you get into the world where now your work is going out to the public, you hope, the general public. And I was incredibly fortunate to be doing small jobs on huge projects. So I'm doing things for Michael Jackson and Metallica, and this is going out to lots and lots and lots of people. And the phrase I always use about this when you start making excuses, and there's a whole nother set of excuses, is, does it start right away? Look at that. You can't go to everybody's house who buys the record and explain why it sucks. It's not an option. So you have to look at these things and then fix them and surpass them and get past the point where they even matter. And I had a very, very hard time with this. When I started mixing more, I used to always send an email with every mix. And it would have some of these things in here, like, hey man, really sorry about the way the chorus hits, but it just wasn't happening, and I don't know why, and maybe it's you, or maybe it's me, but I can't really tell. And again, you're setting yourself up for failure, but also nobody cares. They do not care. They hit play and they either like it or they don't. And that's a really, really important and very, very difficult thing to hold on to as you're working. I now type out long emails with all of these things in them, and then I delete all of it and I say, the mix is on the server, sounds great, and hit send. And sometimes they agree, a lot of times they don't, or it's somewhere in the middle, but it doesn't matter because it's what they were going to think anyway. It's nothing to do with me saying, I forgot to wear trousers when I mix this. I mean, it just doesn't matter. Plus, if you're at a point where you forget to wear trousers, there's all kinds of other problems that come with that. So, looking back on my career, I should have realized this much, much earlier, because one of the first things I did was I got to go on tour with Michael Jackson, which is what led to me working in the studio with him. So we were in South America, man, a huge crowd. Now, this is traditionally thought to be a picture of Michael singing, crowd going nuts. We were in, I believe, Brazil, and does anyone here remember the song Black or White? Does anyone remember the video? It was on MTV, Heavy Rotation. So there's this whole little scene before the song starts, kind of Back to the Future-ish, but basically there's a little kid up in his room with a guitar and a speaker the size of a house, and he hits that opening chord and the song starts. Well, the Michael Jackson concert, things explode when he hits that guitar. There's pyro everywhere, and Michael comes jumping off a trampoline through the pyro and somehow always manages to land right on the downbeat of the song, and the song starts. Now, I was on tour because I was handling playback, and there was a live band, and they played, but there was a lot of other stuff going on. And this one show, he jumped through the pyro, hit the stage, and absolutely nothing happened. Nothing came out of the speakers. It was crickets and tumbleweeds in a stadium with 40,000 people. And I could have said, excuse me, Michael, I just want to tell you that the single here had a problem, right? There was this button, and the button had a lot of goop in it from all of the pyro. We've been on tour for about 4 months, and it really got goopy. And I know we have an air-conditioned tent for that thing, but it was out in the open, and the button got stuck. So then when we hit start, instead of starting, it reset the sequencer to the middle of the sequence because it was the mark button that was stuck, and you hit. Nobody cares. So that's actually him saying, what the hell is going on? Not really, but there you go. But I did not take that lesson to heart. I was still sending emails about Trousers and the bass and Did You Edit the Drums years and years after this, whereas this is the ultimate version, and any live gig is that version, right? You cannot explain away a bad gig. If your mix isn't great, you can just keep working on it. So that's the joy of writing music or working on recorded music, is you can keep going until you think it's time to go. Okay, so now we're going to get to the slightly pretentious part of, if we haven't gotten there already, I don't know. We might have. So I just wanted to sort of take this concept of what comes out of the speakers and zoom out and from more of a composition angle and more of an overall art angle. And I used to read articles, I don't know why I don't read articles anymore, but I used to read articles where there was a lot of discussion in literature about author intent versus reader experience. And there were lots of people arguing that the author's intent absolutely did not matter. And that made me so angry. Like, what are you kidding? They've spent months or years writing this book. They have crafted every tiny word of it. How can it not matter what they were trying to say? And over the years, I have swung completely to the other side of this argument. It doesn't matter what they were trying to say. All that matters is what you think they said, because that's all you get out of it. Now, I love to read interviews with authors about what they were trying to say, because I always feel like I'm an idiot and I miss the point. But if I just read the book, all I get is the equivalent of what came out of the speakers. That is it. Unless there's a 26-page foreword that walks you through all of the big points, that's all you get. And that's really important. And for composers, it is as well. And just a couple of small examples of this. There was a documentary on Elliott Carter when did he turn 100? Or did he not quite make it? So it must have been his 100th birthday. There's a PBS documentary, which is the equivalent of the only good television station in the US. And there was a piece of his being conducted by Pierre Boulez, and they were having a conversation about the dynamics written into the score. Were these the dynamics that the instrumentalist should try and get out of their instrument, or were these the dynamics that the audience was supposed to hear? Because there are things written in odd ranges of an instrument. So on the bass flute, should they be overblowing because it's written triple forte, but it would only really get out at mezzo forte? Or do they need to bring the rest of the orchestra down so that the bass flute could be the loudest thing in the room? And this is a conversation that you have to have, otherwise your piece is ruined. What comes out of the speakers, which is what comes out of the players, is not what you intended. There's also a great interview with John Adams on an American Masters program, another PBS show, where he's talking about watching other people conduct his works, and he's always invited. You know, it's always, oh, it's the premiere in this country, and so he will go, but he's not conducting. And he was talking about how much he hates to be somewhere where the conductor has found this tiny little internal string line and brought it out. Like John didn't know what he'd written. And he said he hated it because it completely changed the piece. So, given that, there is a piece, I'm just going to perform the first two movements because we don't have a huge amount of time. But there is a piece that is the ultimate expression of getting all of that out of the way. So I'm going to put the score up here, and I'll just follow it as we go. Right, I cut it the second movement a little short. When I first heard about this, this is the 4 minutes 33 seconds by John Cage. It's a piece in 3 movements for any instrument. And when I first heard about it, when you hear about it, you think, well, that's a joke, that's not composition. But apparently, John Cage was just obsessed with silence, the idea of silence and how to use it in music. And one of the things he did was to go visit an anechoic chamber, which is a chamber that has absolutely no acoustics of its own. And he went in expecting to finally hear silence. And if you've ever been even just in a quiet room, you know that that's not what you hear. You hear your own nervous system and the blood pumping in your ears. And he realized that there was absolutely nothing that was silent. And so what this piece was, and it was premiered at, I can't remember which music festival it was, but it was an outdoor venue. So there were 3 walls to the venue, and it's in the woods somewhere. And it was a full 4 minutes and 33 seconds of David Tudor sitting at the piano and opening and closing the lid twice. And the first 30 seconds, everybody's thinking, God, what an idiot. And then the next 30 seconds, they're probably thinking, God, what an idiot. And apparently people were leaving. But the idea was, by about 2 minutes in, if you gave yourself over to it, you would experience whatever your experience of the room was, and the piece had no influence on you whatsoever. So now, not only have you gotten rid of the speakers, the performer, the conductor, everything, you've even gotten rid of the composer. And so now, this is, in a way, pure art, because the listener experience is all there is. There's nothing else there. So that's kind of the ultimate end game to what I'm talking about. And man, that was pretentious. So, just one other thing I want to talk about before I get to the kind of last ditch here is the one thing that music has, and movies and TV to some extent, as art forms that other art, physical art, like paintings and sculpture, don't have, is the idea that you actually need playback. This, actually, I should have had the jagged white speaker on this slide. But so when you play something back, it matters what speakers you play it on, it matters what room you're in, it matters what mood the listener's in, but that kind of goes with everything. But there are all kinds of factors that just go to the playback of your piece of art, that change it. And I was trying to think of an example in art, and I couldn't really think of one until I remembered I'm a huge fan of Cy Twombly, a very abstract painter. And his later paintings are all just big red swirls. And that's it. And I got a catalogue raisonné, I pronounced that somewhat okay, of his final works, and every single page is red swirls. And I'm a huge fan, and even I just thought, this is insane. This book was so expensive. And it's just red swirls. And the book's about this big, beautiful prints. And I didn't really think much of it because I'm still a fan, and I would go see him everywhere I could. And there was one time I was at the Tate Modern with my wife, and in their permanent collection, they own quite a few Twomblys, and they had one gallery room, which is probably about the front third of this room, with one door. So you walk in this door, and on the walls are 3 of these paintings. And they are massive. And I laughed out loud when I saw them, They created such an amazing emotional response. I mean, I'm feeling it right now just thinking about being in the room with these 3 gigantic red swirls. And that's it. And that John Cage's piece was actually inspired by white canvas paintings by Mark Rothko. This idea of the size and the scale, and we're actually going to go see a Damien Hirst exhibition where there's a statue that's 3 stories tall. The idea of getting in the room with that is amazing, and that's very difficult for people who work with music. So I think we actually have sort of the opposite side of this, where we can't make something that's just massive, because then someone's going to listen to it on their iPhone. So you actually have to create art that can transcend the playback system and transcend the speakers that it comes out of, so that what comes out of the speakers is always the same and always gets the same emotion to the listener. And I know I'm known for my punchy mixes, apparently. I'm also known for my incredibly loud mixes. But those incredibly loud mixes on laptop speakers are still aggressive and have energy. And I think that that's something I've always strived to get, is to have what's important about what I do not be reliant upon the playback medium, because that's like relying upon a performer to perform your piece. And I'm sure John Cage would have been appalled at that. The timing was totally wrong. I wasn't paying attention, really. I was just sitting there thinking, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. So anyway, back to this idea of playback, and we're going to get to questions in just a few minutes. One of the things I said before that I think is really important, and this is where this idea can actually expand out of the arts and just into your general life, is that these recordings are the things you can manipulate, right? You have control over them, you decide when they start and stop, but as soon as you hit play with other people in the room, you completely lose control. And they go out into the world, and that's all they do. So now I've got some very graphics-heavy demonstrations of how this can apply to the rest of your life. So here are 2 people, all right? These are people in the world, and we'll label them very cleverly. That's the speaker, get it? Get it? Okay. This is silly, but it's also, at least for me, it's profound in a way that isn't mind-blowing, but it's something you have to continually think of over and over and over. As a person, we all have internal dialogues going in our heads, and they can be all kinds of things, good, bad, indifferent, and whatever. So you're thinking bad thoughts. So this is how good my graphics are. I couldn't figure out how to make that kind of like a thought bubble. So just pretend that that's got rounded edges on it. The speaker, thinking about the audience, is having these horrible thoughts. If they then let those thoughts come out of the speaker, the audience gets sad. This is not good, right? Especially if that's your wife or your children or your coworkers or your students or your professor. That's not the way to go. The better way to go is to think stormy thoughts and talk sunshine. This happens all the time. You're on the way to a meeting, you got an email about that meeting, and man, that guy doesn't get what I want to do, and you walk into me like, hi, how are you? That's great. And I got your email, and I'm not really sure about this thing. And then the audience is happy, and you can coerce them into getting your way. But if you don't, you leave a legacy of storm. But if you do this, it leads to love. And all you need is love. So anyway, reality is that is a way you can think about your own legacy, either as an artist or as a composer, as a mixer, as a sculptor, or as a father, as anything. It's only what actually comes out, that gets out into the world where you can't control it anymore, that matters. And it's all anyone will ever remember. And if you're lucky, you control it so that you keep the stuff you want inside, and only the stuff that goes out, goes out. So, end of pretension. Let's have questions about compressors. What do you say? So that's it. That's all I have to say about that. Easy ones. Yes.
So I've got one about, it's kind of about the kind of difference between, the kind of interaction between like arrangement and mix. And so I was chatting to someone about, I wonder what your thoughts are. I was chatting to today. And interesting because obviously there's a lot of the pop music coming out at the moment isn't necessarily quite as band-based as it used to be. And thinking back to obviously when a band like Metallica were kind of coming through, and they were in these shitty rehearsal studios with awful amps, like they haven't got like the mess of boots that they have now. And they're kind of back then kind of just learning about how to sound less crap, if you know what I mean. Like they play through, they didn't know how to hear anything or anything like that. And then they've got this voice, you've got James Hetfield's voice, and like how can we like make this sound less crap? And then they eventually, I'd imagine through trial and error, just learn how to make it sound better. Like, you know, like so just like they learn to write their riffs around the kind of spectral kind of space of James Hetfield's voice. And I'm wondering what you kind of think about when that kind of finally gets to mix and you hear a band that kind of arrange something that's massively like overproduced and they're saying like, oh yeah, why don't you just like multi-band side chain this and like sort that out and you should be able to kind of fit everything together. But whereas really what you kind of want is to kind of go back to that and go back to that kind of growing up and just make it sound less crap without the kind of facility to do that.
Yeah, I think though the core of what you're saying is starting with not a myth, but there's no such thing as sounds good. I mean, from an audiophile perspective, there are people who will only listen to Steely Dan and the Yellow Jackets, right? But musically, you're stuck with that because that's what sounds that way. There are songs on early Stones records where they use the cassette demo because it never felt as good. So it's important that it sounds appropriate. It's not important that it sounds good. I was making a playlist for this podcast I did, and they wanted a playlist, and we talked about the Dead Kennedys, and so I was diving through Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables. I'm not going to say the name of the song I chose because it's not for hallowed halls such as these. But it sounds terrible. It's horrible, but it's so exciting. And I think with a band like Metallica, I mean, if you look at what Rick Rubin did on the album that he produced, is he tried to get their writing back to the way they used to write, where it was about the riffs. And these are 7.5-minute songs with sections, and he wasn't trying to be concise and write a 4-minute song. But I think as a mixer, I'm always trying to make stuff sound great. But the great is that when you get to the chorus, it gets big and it gets heavy and it explodes and it's wide and it's more exciting. You can't settle for something that you think sounds good, and you can't force a band to not sound like what they want to sound like. Now, the very end of your question where you said the band comes in and wants you to sidechain this and stuff, like, I'm the one who decides what I'm sidechaining or not sidechaining. And it's one of the things I love, and it's actually, I meant to talk about it in here. I've moved from using lots and lots of equipment to just on a laptop. And the joy of that is that nobody comes over. I just send mixes, so people actually just listen. But it used to be, they'd walk into this room full of gear, which was up on the screen before, and like, hey, what are you using on the bass? Oh man, I hate that compressor. And that was it, they hated the bass. And you had to change it. And that's just perception, and that can hit every single part of the creative process. It's writing a chorus a certain way because you think you have to try and make more money. So I think for mixing, I'm always trying to mix what I'm given. I'm trying to understand, why did you give me this to mix? And I'm trying to make it work. And every once in a while, I have to say, there's something wrong and I'm going to fix it. Not my mix sucks because the song sucks, but like, hey, that first chorus was twice as long as it should be. I chopped it up and made a little reintro, and I think this is better. And you sort of go that way on the arrangement. But in general, I'm trying to just make the really exciting version of whatever I was given. And sonically, if that can sound good as well, that's great, but it's not the mission at all, for me anyway, which is why I don't have any engineering Grammys, and may never. Yeah.
I think on the subject of that, I've got old Metallica bootlegs on tape, Hammersmith in A whatever, and you listen to them and they sound fantastic. The recording's crap. You know,
Yeah, but they're on fire.
Yeah, exactly. And then you watch Metallica now on stage, and it feels really scripted. And I'm a massive Metallica fan. And their performances are still scripted. You go back and watch what he did yesterday with Busting Away Home, 1984 recordings of Killing All Stuff, where James is extremely voice and broken, and they're brilliant. And I think the performance is more important than where you're recording, what you're recording on, and all these sort of things. If you can capture a great performance, if it's a bit hissy, it's a bit crackly, who cares?
Yeah. Though there are times when it's so hissy and so crackly that you actually can't pay attention to the music. So it swings, it really does. And it's finding that balance and deciding what you can use and what you can't and how to get out of it what you need. So I'm going to let Dan decide who gets to ask questions, because otherwise I'll get in trouble.
So you talked very briefly about analog and digital. When you're approaching a mix, what makes you decide how much you want to go for the sort of very new processes, and what makes you want to go back and kind of choose the vintage stuff, and where you strike the balance between that when you have this wealth?
I don't. I was 100% on gear until I wasn't, and now I'm 100% in the computer, period. And whether I'm using emulations of analog gear or not doesn't matter. That transition was very difficult for me, and it caused a lot of angst. It's like my power is in the analog gear. This is why I'm good. And that's in that second list of things that don't come out of the speakers. The gear doesn't come out of the speakers. So I had to get over myself and realize that either I had the talent to be good, no matter what the tools were. And obviously, to say that is a little disingenuous. You do need a set of tools that are up to some level, otherwise you just can't do certain things. But there isn't a single plugin I can't work without. There isn't a single piece of gear I can't work without. And I think that if I ever get to the point where I feel like I can't work without them, I have to change it. And I've done that. I've actually, in the last month, stopped using a compressor on my mixes that I've been using for the last 15 years, both analog and in the computer. And I finally changed the way it was set up so it would be a little bit quieter when I listened with it. And that, of course, nothing sounds better than louder. I'm like, no, I don't need that compressor. And I've actually managed to wean myself off it, and it took forever. But I think for mixing, the process is completely irrelevant. While you're recording, the process can be relevant only in terms of how it affects the performers. There are sessions that are great to do on tape because you're making people make decisions. Do you like that guitar solo, or would you like to record over it? Not make a playlist. It will be gone forever, even if the new solo sucks, and then we'll just have to do another one. So you make these decisions along the way, and I think creatively some musicians really thrive with that, or some musicians need it. But the analog versus digital as a gear/process thing, I don't know. For me right now, it's not really, that's not a concept that makes any sense to me. I just try and make them super loud and exciting.
I got the video where you explain about your mixing template, and there's one thing I didn't quite get about the rear bus. Do the instruments go directly to the master, and you're using the rear bus as a side compression type thing?
How many people in the room don't know what he's talking about? I just want to find out, because unfortunately, rear bus has become a thing that I'm known for. It's a stereo parallel compressor that I use while I'm mixing. And everything in the mix except the drums usually goes to that stereo compressor, and it's blended in. So everything still goes to the mix bus. There's nothing the way I mix is all of the tracks go to the mix bus, and then they also all go off to lots and lots and lots of other places, the way you would think of using reverbs or delays, but it happens to be distortion and compression, and then all that stuff gets blended back in. So the uncompressed version of everything makes it to the mix, and then it's blended in with lots of overcompressed combined versions. So the rear bus is just the stereo compressor for lots and lots of stuff, but it is a parallel one. See, that's easy to talk about gear.
I'm just kind of curious, you talked about how you like your mixes to be extremely loud. How has that affected your relationships with mastering engineers?
They hate me. They do. They hate me. There are some mastering engineers that just don't like what I do. But then there's some who take what I give them and they're really happy with it because they don't have to do anything. So it comes down to just musical taste, really. I mean, because most of the successful mastering engineers have a thing that they do, and they're pretty consistent with what they do. So they basically have a mix chain. They have compressors and EQ. They like to put everything through. When it's a really quiet, uncompressed mix, they can do that, and then they get out the character that they like to put on mixes. And I only sort of twigged to exactly what was going on when I had a conversation with someone who was saying, mixes are too loud, I need quieter versions. I said, well, but if I take that compressor off, it's going to feel completely different. And he actually said to me on the phone, I hate the way you compress your mixes. Like, oh, right, okay, which is fine. But then I shouldn't have him mastering my mixes. Someone else should be mastering them. So it is problematic. My mixes have actually been getting quieter and quieter lately. And I think getting rid of that compressor has helped quite a bit. But it's not, I mean, it's never loud because I think, like, oh, the mix feels great, now I'm going to make it loud. That's how the mix gets built, and I'm always fighting it, and I hate how loud they are. I really, really do. I've got 3 different places in my template I can make it quieter, and I'm constantly striving to make it quieter and quieter, but still have it feel the same. And there are people who will say, well, when you listen to the mix, you can just turn it up. Well, that's true, but that's only if you're on something where you can turn it up. If you're going to listen through your phone or through your laptop speakers, it's not going to get that loud. And it better sound huge coming out of something tiny. And I have not figured out a way to do that without the mix being loud, because that's what makes it do that. It gives you the appearance of driving speakers and driving the air in a room in this sawed-off waveform. So yeah, master engineers don't like me, but I just find ones that I can work with, because the ones that like the way I do things will tell me when something's wrong, and I actually believe them, because the other ones are just telling me everything's wrong.
Can I just ask one, do you have an opinion on why there's still some people winning in all sorts of engineering world? You've got kind of Susan Rogers, Sylvia Massey, but
Yeah, you've got
it's really balanced still.
yeah, Catherine Brooks coming up right now. There are a few. Look, it's a locker room. Every studio is a locker room. I mean, traditionally it was worse, I think, than it is now, because you always went to a studio and there was always money, which meant everybody was drunk all the time. Nobody acts right when they're drunk. Their filter goes off, right? Everything comes out of the speakers when you're drunk. So I think that's part of it, that it was just a very not friendly place and even for men who had sensibilities. You know, you had to be a bro to get on in a lot of sessions. But I think also, it happens across every single industry, where if you walk into a room and you're there for anything even slightly technical, and there's a man and a woman in the room, everyone assumes that the man is the one who does the job and the woman is their assistant or hanging out or whatever, isn't the one there to do the technical thing. So you immediately have a hurdle when you're a woman that you have to overcome, where any guy can sit in the back of the room and suck at his job, but no one questions why he's there in the first place. He actually has to screw up to get fired, whereas a woman has to prove themselves to just stay in the room, and it's not good. But I think it's also why, like, Sylvia Massey does lots of artwork, she does books, she does guerrilla recording, that's become a thing, and she loves doing it. But you also make a name for yourself shooting a piano with a shotgun. That's something that people say, oh, right, Sylvia. And so she's really, really cool for that. Catherine Marks has her thing. Unfortunately, as a woman, I think you have to have a thing to stick around. You have to have something that makes people think, oh, right, that's exactly why they're there, because it is questioned as soon as it comes up. So I don't have an answer how to fix it at all. I mean, society is getting a little bit better now that you're actually allowed to accuse people of molesting you all of a sudden out of the blue, but it's tough. I should have stopped talking 2 sentences ago.
You've worked for an awful lot with the Chili Peppers. When you're working with Flea as a bassist, is there anything you do in your process to balance the fact that he's a very kind of vocal, characterful bass player, who's a very specific place in the band that maybe not all bass players would sit in?
No, you just record him. I mean, he's such a good bass player. With all of these people, it's what comes out of the speakers, and for them, it's what comes out of their fingers, and it's what they play and how they play it. So to record them, you just get out of the way. I try to make it as transparent as possible. My microphone setups are very simple. Recording the Chili Peppers is one of the easiest things to do in the world. You get natural sounding microphones in a decent sounding room, and it's the Chili Peppers. I mean, to me, one of the most defining things about them is Chad's hi-hat. I can spot Chad playing on anything from a mile away within 1 bar, because his hi-hat does this weird swimmy thing that no one else's does. That's the Chili Peppers. Flea's bass is the Chili Peppers. And surprisingly, they've managed to go through 3 guitar players, because I don't count the little spot in the middle, who have all been part of the Chili Peppers. And Hillel and John and Josh are all very individual guitar players. But within the context of the band, they sound like the Chili Peppers. So it's just about getting out of the way and making sure that they're comfortable and happy and are hearing what it is that they're already doing coming back to them.
Do you have any good tips for keeping a good perspective on a mix or anything like that?
Get away from it. That's all you can do. One of the genius things about mixing in the box, I'm pointing at a laptop, even though the laptop I use is slightly larger, because otherwise it wouldn't be as cool. It's 100% instant recall on everything, right? So I don't mix one song at a time. When I get a record to mix, I go through and do all the boring stuff first. I prep the sessions, I color code, get the tracks in the right order, import my template, work on the drums to kind of get it working if it's a band with drums. And then I mix the whole album. And I'll do it in alphabetical order, because that's easy. That's the way the folder is. So I open up a song and I work on it for as long as I know what to do. And as soon as I feel like either I don't know what to do, or I know what I have to do, but I'm just not up for it. Like, I need to deal with something that's going to take me a long time and be problematic. I just close it and open up the next one. And I'll cycle through, and every once in a while I'll cycle through starting at the bottom of the alphabet, because otherwise you spend way too much time at the top of the folder. And then I'm always surprised by how far along the mixes are, because you open it up, you're immediately fresh, you listen, and you only react to what you're hearing. I'm reacting to what comes out of the speakers and nothing else, because I don't remember what I did just before I closed it. Because when you're mixing on a console, it sits there, and you have these times during the day when you're not being productive, so you just loop the mix. And it's just playing, and you check your email, or you go to lunch, and you come back, but you still remember everything you did. When you close it and open up the next song immediately, that all gets wiped out. And when you hear it, you just hear where you're at, and like, oh, right, I need to do this. So I never take notes on anything. I just am always being led by what I hear. And this way, instead of having, like when you mix on a console, if you think about it, you usually get 2 times where you come back to that mix fresh. One would be after dinner, because lunch is never long enough and you're not far enough along. And one would be the next morning, if you're lucky enough to leave it up to print the next morning and then start the next mix before lunch, so you're not far enough along, etc. That's it. If I'm mixing a record now, I might get 7 or 8 times where I've opened up that song and heard it as if someone else had mixed it to this point. And it's brilliant. And it makes me get out of my own head. It makes me only not pay attention to all those lists of stupid things I had up on the board. It's really about not keeping track of what you've done up to a certain point and just reacting to where you are. And the only way to do that is to either go to sleep for a long time or work on something else. So work on something else if you can.
I was wondering how you think about the sound field when you're mixing, and more specifically thinking in terms of middle and sides and what that actually means.
Well, when I mixed on my Neve console, it had buttons for each speaker. There was a left button and a right button. If you put them both in, it was in the middle. If you wanted anywhere else, you had to switch in a pan circuit, which would drop the level. And because it got quieter, I convinced myself it didn't sound as good either. I turned it up again and like, no, it's not the same. So I've mixed very much hard panned, left, center, right. As soon as I moved into Pro Tools, like, ooh, I can put stuff anywhere, because that pan circuit's always active. And you put it there and it stays there, as opposed to an old Neve where you put it there and it kind of wanders around a little bit and different frequencies go different places. So I use panning a lot to make the arrangement work. If you've got 3 picking guitars in a chorus or a bridge or something like that, just messing with the panning to get either 2 of them to work together as one or to spread all 3 out so you hear all 3. I'm constantly doing that. I have no preconceived notion of what it should be. I like the kick, the snare, the bass, the vocal in the middle as a rule, but that doesn't always happen. But for the most part it does, and then I like other stuff to be wide. I love using plugins that stretch the stereo spectrum, like what's the name of the Isotope just put out the Ozone stereo Imager, Ozone Imager, I think for free. Get it. It's amazing. You just go and it goes either from a mono thing or a stereo thing. So I love using spatial effects, but I think that really that sort of spatial thing is to build your arrangement, to get things to work together. But then it's things like delays and reverbs and EQ. If you dull something off, it sounds like it's coming from further away. So using that to try and get front to back, that's where you make a mix that's really good. If you're just really spread out here, that's great, but it's also very difficult to listen to after a while. But if you can spread out that way, then what it does is it lets the listener focus on the really important things the first 4 or 5 times, and then start diving inside, because they start to know the things that are up front, and they'll start to hear the weird little piano fill and the guitar reverb that's opposite the guitar, and all of the really cool stuff that you did as a mixer, which nobody cares about. But if they love the song, they'll get in there and find it. So I try to use front to back. I've just made this up. I've never said this before out loud. So it could be true. But I think the front to back is where you kind of really build something that's going to be a mix that really will stand the test of time, as opposed to just spreading it left and right. I have to write that down.
Is there a particular mix you've done that you listen to now and you wish you could revisit?
Every single mix I've ever done. Every single one. I mean, sitting here listening before, it's like, yeah, I'm lucky and those mixes suck. Yeah, everything. There's always something. But it doesn't matter. You know, that is the version of that song, and if the artist was happy with it, then there you go. And there's some mixes where you do things because the artist wants them and it doesn't necessarily end up where you want it. There are some mixes you do that you're absolutely thrilled with when you finish them. And then you listen a week later, or a month later. What's good is that sometimes years later, when you haven't heard it, you can actually appreciate it because you've forgotten all the little stuff about it and you hear the big picture. It's like 99 Problems is one of those mixes, which is like, wow, that's actually pretty cool. That's good. And Danny California, I think that's a good one. There are little things in there that still bug me, but it will always bug you, but it has to. If you're not a perfectionist, you're not an artist. And there's a great saying that no record is ever finished, they're only abandoned. And it's true. There's nothing to say that any artistic decision is right. Therefore, you're never done making decisions. You're never done working on anything ever. You just have to stop. Otherwise, you'll be someone who never puts out the one record that they've been making their whole lives. So, yeah, it's actually, when I do the seminars in France, the Mix of the Masters seminars, and there are a lot of people there who are really, really talented, but they spend months on a mix of their own stuff. And the best advice I can give them is start mixing that again from scratch and give yourself 3 hours, because you know it inside out. You know where everything is. Do a 3-hour mix, leave it for a week, come back and tweak that, and you'll be done in probably 5 hours total. Because you just get up your own, So, yeah.
Just to follow up on that, what makes you stop? Is it running out of time, or what?
No, it's actually a really good question, because of course you would think then at some point I'm just giving up, because otherwise how would I ever send a mix? But I get to the point where in the short term I don't know what else I would do. And it's not that I don't know what else I could do to make it better, it's I don't hear anything that needs to be fixed anymore. I get to the chorus and it goes, it's exciting. I get goosebumps in the bridge because I got the reverb balance on the vocal right. All of that kind of stuff. And I just get to the point where I don't know what I would do to it. And that's when I have to send it. Sometimes it's done. And sometimes I get comments back from the artist like, hey, did you mean to do this? And it's something that's just crazy that I was so used to that I didn't hear anymore. But it's much faster to have somebody else hear that and then fix it. And that's the other thing about mixing in the computer. I'm not on a time crunch for doing recalls and making changes. It doesn't matter when it comes in. I get an email, I can open up the session, make changes, and I'm hearing it fresh, and it might be an hour later, it might be 3 weeks later, it doesn't matter. But I do get to the point where I have no reservations about sending the mix for precisely the reasons I said before. You can't fill up an email with all that stuff to explain why you're sending the mix now. So you do have to get to the point where you think it's done, or as done as you can make it without input.
Stereo feels important, as you said, but there's a lot of advice online and on the various YouTube channels and that about mixing the mono, getting your EQs right, mono, and this sort of thing. And I've done that, and you press stereo, right? What do you think about that approach?
I don't do it. I mean, I could talk about it a lot, but I won't. The only thing I'd say is you have to mix for the way people are going to listen. But you don't mix in mono because iPhone speakers are mono. Because you're already at the point where they're iPhone speakers. You might as well buy yourself an AM transmitter and mix through that. You need to know what's going on. You can't build a mix where if you aren't hearing everything below 40 hertz, it kind of falls apart. So you need to be smart. And mixes need to translate. The EQing and even panning in mono is a technique that I never understood and I never came to terms with, and it never worked for me. For other people, it works really, really well. Don't discount it. And if it's something that works for you, you should continue to do it. I personally just have it doesn't help.
Can I ask how you approach projects as a producer? You also produce records yourself, so do you go with an artist straight from the rehearsal room, within there?
Yeah, if you're producing, I mean, the most important thing is the songs. There's nothing that matters more than that. And then the second most important thing is the performance of the songs. And the most important thing about that is the vocal, if there is a vocal. So you have to get that right. And my favorite part of record making is pre-production, because you're sitting in a room playing like human Pro Tools. Like, hey, let's make that 2 bars longer. Hey, why don't you play a drum fill like that? Ooh, the kick pattern in the chorus should line up with the bass. And I love that. But you very much have to change hats. Like if I'm producing and engineering, which is usually the case because there's never any money, I will engineer for the first 3 or 4 hours and get sounds on everything. And then I switch it off completely. And if I'm lucky enough to have an assistant say, just please tell me if something breaks. Because I'm not going to notice at that point. I'm only listening as a producer because I can't do both things at once. And then when you start mixing, it's really important to stop producing. Because otherwise, you're mixing and the chorus isn't happening. You're like, hey, let's put another guitar on there. No, you decided already that the arrangement was right. There has to be a way to make it work. And if there isn't, you will exhaust every option trying to make it work and then go back and say, well, I guess I better put a guitar on here. So I think it's really important to compartmentalize the jobs that you do, especially because if you're a composer, you're going to do every job, right? You're going to write it, perform it, mix it, do all the pre-production yourself, arrange it. It's brutal, and I think that if you try and do it all at once and solve production problems by writing or mixing problems by recording, you're never going to finish. It's impossible.
Are you still able to hear as a consumer?
I'm not that great at that, but it's the coming back to the mix fresh. I mean, I know that I'm a really picky, horrible consumer. I hate everything. So I know that, so I have to make myself like it. Whereas, like Rick Rubin is the ultimate consumer. He happens to share taste with millions of people, and that's why people buy the records he produces. But you're always making the record you want to hear, with the caveat that it's not your record, it's the artist's record, and you have to make the record that the artist wants to make, and hopefully you make that version line up with how you want it to be. But you are subservient to the artist. But just as a pure producer, you are the consumer. So you have to make your decisions based on you as the consumer.
Any more questions?
Now you're mixing on a laptop a lot of the time.
All the time.
Yeah. Do you mix a lot more on headphones and speakers?
A lot.
Yeah.
A lot. It's just, there were reasons for it, logistic reasons, of moving and not having a great room to set up my speakers, things like that. So I started doing work in headphones thinking, well, when I get onto the speakers, I'll do the heavy lifting. And as I've gotten more and more used to them, I just do less and less needs to be done on the speakers. The great thing about it, and any recording professor will hate me for this, because they will say you need to mix on speakers, and you do. Especially when you're learning, but the great thing about headphones is you are wearing your studio. You don't have to worry about the fact that you're in a rectangular bedroom that has horrible acoustics. You're wearing it. It's the room as well as the speakers. So if you can manage to find headphones where you can actually hear what's going on and not create problems for yourself, it's amazing. It's brilliant, and it frees you up to work absolutely anywhere and be confident about what you're doing, as opposed to second guessing, which as soon as you get too comfortable with a pair of speakers in a room, anything about that changes and you second guess everything you do because you're not sure if you're hearing it right. Cheap headphones, just buy another pair, break them in for an hour and a half, and you're good. So, yeah, I'm a fan of headphones, but it's difficult.
Okay, I think we'll have to leave there actually. But,
Oh, we have to go eat.
Yeah, we have to go eat some food. So, really, thank you very much to Andrew.
Thank you for coming.